The heavy glass doors of Peak Innovations in downtown Seattle, Washington, seemed impenetrable as Madeline Davis approached them on a crisp Monday morning. The imposing security guard immediately blocked her path, his eyes scanning her plain gray suit and worn leather briefcase with obvious disdain. With a sharp, dismissive tone, he ordered her to turn around and use the service entrance located in the back alley, aggressively pushing her toward the side corridor, before she could utter a single word of explanation. She attempted to calmly state her business, but the guard roughly snatched the identification lanyard from her neck and tossed it directly into a nearby metal trash can. Another guard chuckled from the desk, mocking her credentials and telling her to purchase a better forgery the next time she tried to sneak into a corporate building. He unceremoniously opened her briefcase, dumping a stack of meticulously organized papers onto the polished floor. A passing senior executive did not even pause his stride. He merely sneered, stepped directly onto her scattered resume with his expensive leather shoe, and loudly demanded that someone remove the woman before the real executives arrived for the morning session. None of those arrogant men could have possibly imagined that this quiet, unassuming woman had not come to clean the corporate headquarters, but rather to cleanse the entire company from the inside out. Madeline Davis was the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Peak Innovations, arriving in Seattle exactly 3 weeks ahead of her scheduled official introduction to the board. After hearing deeply troubling rumors about a toxic, discriminatory work environment, she had chosen to observe the corporate culture entirely undercover. By ditching her usual designer attire for a simple outfit and pulling her hair into a basic knot, she needed no elaborate disguise to successfully blend in as an ordinary, entry-level employee. Gathering her scattered documents with quiet dignity, she approached the main reception desk with a steady, confident stride and requested directions to the board of directors' meeting room. The receptionist barely bothered to lift her eyes from her glowing computer monitor, her gaze momentarily flickering over Madeline's unstyled hair and modest clothing with visible judgment. In a slow, highly condescending voice, the receptionist instructed her to take the elevator to the 7th floor, explicitly stating that human resources handled all the menial, entry-level applicants. Madeline took a deep, centering breath, offered a polite smile, and walked toward the elevator bank without a single word of complaint. In the sterile waiting room of the Human Resources Department, 3 sharply dressed male candidates arrived long after she did. Yet all were warmly greeted and ushered into interviews ahead of her. She waited patiently for 40 agonizing minutes before a mid-level manager finally emerged to address her, speaking with an exaggeratedly slow cadence, as if Madeline could not comprehend basic English. The manager pompously offered to explain the fundamental structure of the corporation, assuming Madeline was completely ignorant of how a modern technology firm operated. Madeline simply nodded in silent agreement, carefully registering every condescending gesture and making mental notes of the glaring inequality she was actively experiencing. When Human Resources eventually sent her up to the executive floor, she was immediately intercepted by the exact same security guards who had harassed her in the lobby. This time, she flashed a small portion of her genuine corporate access badge, just enough to legally prove she had security clearance, though keeping her executive title hidden. The guards reluctantly stepped aside, offering absolutely no apologies for their earlier behavior, while one of them muttered a dark threat, warning her not to make them regret letting her pass. Madeline ignored the hostility and advanced down the grand hallway, her quiet footsteps echoing against the gleaming marble floors, surrounded by intimidating modern art. At the center of the bustling executive suite stood Edward Sterling, the chief operating officer, a tall, fiercely confident man wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that practically radiated unchecked authority. He was barking rapid-fire instructions to his visibly anxious assistant, Sarah Brooks, whilst impatiently checking his luxury wristwatch and complaining about the agonizing slowness of his subordinates. Madeline approached him politely, excusing herself and stating that she was there to attend the highly anticipated 10 o'clock strategy meeting. Edward looked her up and down, his expression rapidly shifting from mild surprise to a mask of absolute, freezing arrogance. With a biting, dismissive tone, Edward informed her that the meeting was strictly reserved for top-tier directors, and cruelly suggested she was completely lost. When Madeline calmly clarified that the board had explicitly requested her presence from the very beginning, Edward's face flushed with angry red patches as he loudly mocked diversity initiatives. Looking around to his fellow executives for support, he dramatically ordered Sarah to make sure Madeline remained seated in the outer hallway until they deemed her worthy of entry. Madeline peacefully took a seat outside the glass-walled conference room, pulled out her mobile phone, and sent a single text message to her allies saying that the toxic rumors were absolutely confirmed. From her vantage point outside the transparent glass walls, Madeline carefully observed the high-stakes meeting unfold, noting how Edward Sterling dominated the room with a booming, theatrical enthusiasm. He proudly projected colorful charts onto the large digital screen, openly boasting about the complete cancellation of corporate inclusion programs and the massive financial savings resulting from a widening wage gap. The other executives around the large mahogany table simply nodded in obedient agreement, never once questioning his aggressive tactics or his blatant disregard for basic employee welfare. The very few women and minority employees present in the room kept their eyes lowered, remaining completely silent in the face of Edward's overwhelming intimidation. After 30 minutes of uninterrupted bragging, Edward confidently strode out of the conference room with a triumphant smirk, announcing without even looking at Madeline that they were finally ready for the diversity presentation. He rudely informed her that she had exactly 5 minutes to speak, claiming that the real executives had actual, profitable business matters to attend to shortly. Madeline gracefully stood up, gathered her plain folder of notes, and crossed the threshold into the opulent boardroom, immediately feeling the heavy, hostile atmosphere shift against her. The men who had just been laughing uproariously suddenly began checking their phones or engaging in whispered side conversations, blatantly pretending she did not exist. When Madeline began to calmly address the deeply concerning areas of the workplace culture, an older executive with silver hair loudly interrupted her, rudely demanding that she skip to the point. Another director dramatically checked his watch, audibly sighing and complaining that some people in the room had actual work to accomplish. Unfazed, Madeline continued delivering her data until one of the executives intentionally bumped into her, spilling hot coffee all over her carefully prepared documents while offering a completely unapologetic smirk. Taking his cue, Edward smugly signaled to his assistant, Sarah, demanding that she escort the bothersome woman to the exit immediately. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind her, the roaring, mocking laughter of the executive group echoed loudly through the quiet hallway, cutting through the tense air. Edward's voice carried through the wood, loudly complaining about how much precious time was entirely wasted on absurd diversity initiatives that only served to hinder corporate progress. Walking away down the long corridor, Madeline felt absolutely no sense of shame or defeat. Instead, an intense, righteous fire burned brightly within her chest. She stepped into the women's restroom, carefully placed her coffee-stained portfolio on the marble sink, and stared at her own reflection with unshakable determination. There were no tears in her eyes, only a fierce resolve to completely dismantle the toxic empire Edward had so carefully constructed. Pulling out her phone, she dialed the private number of Lauren Newman, the formidable president of the corporate board, who answered on the very first ring. Madeline recounted every appalling detail of the morning, from the aggressive lobby guards and the dismissive human resources manager to the utter humiliation she endured inside the boardroom. Lauren breathed a heavy sigh, expressing deep outrage, and immediately offered to convene an emergency board session that very afternoon to formally terminate the offenders. Madeline firmly declined the immediate intervention, explaining that striking too early would simply allow the guilty executives to hide their most damning financial records and bury the truth. She insisted on waiting exactly 2 days for the mandatory quarterly meeting, where every single director was required to present their departmental results directly to the new chief executive. Lauren reluctantly agreed to the strategic delay, promising to keep Madeline's true identity an absolute secret until the perfect moment presented itself. Just as Madeline ended the phone call, A very soft, hesitant knock echoed from the restroom door, interrupting her racing thoughts. The door crept open to reveal Sarah Brooks, Edward's deeply nervous assistant, who constantly glanced over her shoulder into the empty hallway as if expecting a monster to appear. In a trembling whisper, Sarah apologized profusely for failing to defend Madeline in the boardroom, explaining that anyone who ever dared to contradict Edward was immediately and ruthlessly fired. Madeline softened her posture and gently asked the frightened assistant to tell her everything about the hidden realities of working under Edward's tyrannical management. Sarah confessed that she had been secretly hoarding physical copies of deleted employee complaints and buried termination records, hoping that one day someone would finally bring justice to the Seattle office. Sarah detailed numerous heartbreaking cases where incredibly talented employees were unjustly dismissed simply because they threatened Edward's fragile ego, and how well-earned promotions were regularly denied based on blatant personal biases. Madeline looked at the brave assistant with profound respect, realizing that this young woman was the crucial missing key to unlocking the entire corrupt system. She told Sarah that the long-awaited day of justice had finally arrived, and she would urgently need her assistance to access the restricted corporate archives. Sarah nodded with newfound courage, sealing a dangerous but necessary alliance that would soon shake Peak Innovations to its absolute core. Early the next morning, the bright Seattle sun filtered through the towering glass windows of Peak Innovations as Madeline arrived hours before the general workforce. She walked with a quiet, measured confidence, carrying a standard laptop inside a remarkably unassuming gray sleeve, remaining completely invisible to the few early risers scattered around the lobby. Everyone still believed she was merely a low-level consultant from the Human Resources Department, completely ignorant of the immense power she actually held. Sarah was already nervously waiting near the Western elevator banks, doing her best to mask her intense anxiety with a forced, polite smile. Sarah quickly guided Madeline down a deserted corridor, whispering that she had secured an abandoned office in the West Wing that was historically only used by visiting external auditors. Madeline praised the strategic location, noting that it was perfectly secluded, yet perilously close to Edward Sterling's main suite, providing them with an ideal covert operations center. Inside the cramped but highly functional room, Sarah rapidly connected her personal laptop to the restricted internal corporate network. She then handed Madeline a massively thick, heavy folder, stuffed completely full of printed emails, hidden financial ledgers, and buried performance evaluations. For several intense hours, Madeline meticulously reviewed the vast mountain of hidden evidence, piecing together the undeniable proof of widespread, institutionalized abuse. She discovered a brilliant female software engineer who had dedicated 8 years to the company without receiving a single salary increase or promotion. Right next to that file was the record of a fiercely underqualified male employee, a personal golfing buddy of Edward's, who had been promoted twice within his first 3 months. Madeline methodically highlighted these blatant discrepancies, building a bulletproof preliminary report that clearly demonstrated women were earning a massive fraction less than their male counterparts in identical roles. While she was deeply engrossed in analyzing the horrifying statistics regarding mysteriously deleted sexual harassment claims, a large, menacing shadow suddenly fell across her small wooden desk. Edward Sterling stood squarely in the narrow doorway, his arms tightly crossed over his chest, his face twisted into a furious, demanding scowl. With a harsh, barking voice, he demanded to know exactly what she was doing, sneaking around the executive wing, and why she was handling private corporate property. Madeline did not flinch. She slowly lifted her gaze, looked him directly in the eye, and calmly stated she was simply reviewing essential personnel metrics for the Human Resources Division. Edward forcefully stepped into the tiny office, completely ignoring basic boundaries, and aggressively snatched a highly sensitive payroll document directly from her hands. He coldly declared that the files were strictly confidential, and that a lowly diversity hire had absolutely no authorization to view corporate financial data. Madeline held his furious stare without a single ounce of fear, replying with an incredibly steady voice, that she possessed all the necessary authority required to investigate the matter. Her unyielding confidence infuriated Edward even further. He angrily pulled out his mobile phone, dialed the security desk, and loudly demanded that 2 officers report to the West Wing immediately. Madeline did not panic or rush. She deliberately and slowly packed her laptop and the remaining folders into her plain leather briefcase, while Edward watched her with a highly satisfied, arrogant smirk. Within minutes, the same 2 security guards from the previous morning arrived, one of them openly groaning when he recognized Madeline standing there yet again. Edward aggressively ordered the men to physically escort the stubborn woman completely off the corporate premises, and to permanently wipe her security credentials from the master building system. Madeline calmly stood up, adjusted her simple jacket, and prepared to leave the room without resisting the guard's physical presence. Before walking through the door, Madeline stopped, turned slightly, and locked eyes with the triumphant chief operating officer one final time. In a low, chillingly authoritative voice, she warned Mr. Sterling that the documentation he just touched was incredibly important, and that he would be wise to remember her exact words. The strange, powerful comment visibly unsettled Edward for a brief fraction of a second, but his massive ego quickly recovered, and he stubbornly refused to offer any reply. As the guards marched her toward the main lobby elevators, Edward remained entirely blissfully unaware that the hallway security cameras had flawlessly recorded his aggressive, unauthorized confiscation of the confidential files. That same afternoon, Madeline relocated her covert operation to the bustling ground-floor corporate cafe, calmly sipping a green tea while typing furiously on her laptop. She seamlessly blended into the background, quietly observing the palpable, heavy tension among the lower-level employees, who spoke only in hushed, fearful whispers. Suddenly, Edward stormed into the cafe, flanked by his loud, sycophantic executive friends, deliberately taking the most central table and laughing with obnoxious, performative volume. Thomas Riley, the notoriously observant chief financial officer, noticed the brewing confrontation and gracefully stepped in, inviting Madeline to join their table, which led to a furious Edward intentionally knocking a full glass of ice water directly onto Madeline's remaining paperwork. The following morning dawned over Seattle with a thick, heavy layer of gray clouds, perfectly matching the intense, suffocating tension that gripped the entire executive floor. Today was the mandatory quarterly board meeting, the single most critical event of the fiscal year, and every department head was frantically reviewing their financial projections. Inside the grand boardroom, Edward Sterling paced back and forth at the head of the massive mahogany table, barking authoritative commands to his visibly stressed subordinates. He demanded absolute perfection, warning everyone that there was absolutely no room for improvisation when the new, mysterious chief executive finally arrived from the East Coast. Edward leaned heavily on the table, aggressively instructing his team to completely conceal any lingering personnel issues, canceled inclusion programs, or pending labor lawsuits from the incoming boss. He loudly complained that the corporate board had likely saddled them with another useless diversity hire, insisting they must present a united, impenetrable front to protect their lucrative bonuses. The executives nodded in fearful synchronization, utterly terrified of crossing the man who practically ruled Peak Innovations with an iron fist. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors swung open without a knock, instantly silencing the frantic murmurs that had filled the expansive room. Madeline Davis walked in with a serene, unhurried pace, wearing the exact same modest gray suit she had worn during her previous humiliating encounters. Edward spotted her immediately, his face twisted in raw fury as he violently slammed his hands on the table and demanded to know how she had bypassed building security. Madeline completely ignored his explosive outburst, peacefully walking toward the back of the room and taking a seat in a remarkably unassuming leather chair. Edward wildly signaled to the burly head of security standing by the door, screaming at the man to forcefully drag the trespassing woman out into the street. The head of security, however, hesitated awkwardly, nervously shifting his weight and explaining that the corporate board had sent strict, overriding instructions, allowing all registered observers into the room today. Edward completely lost his temper, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson, as he roared that he absolutely did not care what the distant board members had authorized. He aggressively marched down the length of the long table, towering over Madeline's seated figure, and venomously declared that her pathetic little game was ending right this very second. The surrounding executives held their collective breath, fully expecting the arrogant chief operating officer to physically throw the quiet woman out the door. Madeline did not shrink away. Instead, she looked up at him with eyes as cold and hard as glacial ice. She softly advised Mr. Sterling to be extremely careful with his very next move, her voice so deeply anchored in absolute authority that the entire room instantly froze in stunned silence. Edward blinked, momentarily derailed by the sheer, unyielding power radiating from the unassuming woman he had spent 3 days relentlessly bullying. Before he could formulate another toxic insult, the heavy boardroom doors swung wide open once again, drawing every single eye toward the dramatic entrance. Lauren Newman, the highly respected president of the corporate board, strode confidently into the room, flanked perfectly by 2 senior corporate legal advisors. Her commanding presence instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the space, as she offered a warm, pleasant greeting to the terrified, silent executives. Lauren smiled brightly, scanning the room before noting aloud that she was incredibly pleased to see they had all already met Madeline Davis. Edward took a clumsy step backward, his face scrunching in total, utter confusion, as his brain struggled desperately to process the board president's unexpected words. With a highly strained, shaking voice, Edward asked Lauren what on earth she was talking about, gesturing wildly toward the woman in the cheap gray suit. Lauren's smile vanished, replaced by a gaze of solid steel, as she looked Edward squarely in the eyes and repeated the name with heavy, undeniable emphasis. She formally introduced Madeline Davis to the room as the permanent, newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Peak Innovations, unanimously selected by the board, exactly 3 weeks ago. The revelation hit the room like a massive physical shockwave, completely paralyzing every single person sitting around the expensive mahogany table. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and incredibly profound. No one dared to move a single muscle, let alone breathe, as the executives rapidly exchanged horrified, panicked glances with one another. Edward Sterling's arrogant face completely drained of all its color, turning a sickly, ghostly white as the devastating reality finally crashed down upon his shoulders. He slowly realized that the completely random, supposedly powerless woman he had mercilessly mocked, harassed, and attempted to violently throw out into the street was, in fact, the ultimate ruler of his entire professional universe. Edward stammers violently, desperately trying to salvage his rapidly crumbling career by claiming that the entire situation had to be a terrible, elaborate joke orchestrated by jealous rivals. He wildly accused Madeline of maliciously infiltrating his perfectly managed departments, intentionally provoking hostile reactions, and blatantly manipulating his loyal staff to ruin his flawless reputation. Madeline gracefully stood up from her chair in the back of the room, her voice echoing with crystal-clear authority as she calmly interrupted his frantic, pathetic excuses. She stated that over the past 3 days, she had personally witnessed the deep humiliation, the pervasive fear, and the rampant abuse of power that he had actively fostered. At Madeline's subtle nod, Lauren Newman placed a sleek tablet onto the table and seamlessly projected the compiled corporate security footage onto the massive digital presentation screen. The undeniable visual evidence played silently but powerfully, the lobby guards aggressively shoving Madeline, the receptionist rolling her eyes, and Edward violently snatching the confidential documents from her hands. The entire room watched in horrified fascination as the screen displayed Edward ordering the guards to remove her, cementing his undeniable guilt in high definition. A deeply uncomfortable, suffocating silence blanketed the executives as they finally understood the absolute magnitude of the trap they had so arrogantly walked into. Madeline stepped forward, explaining clearly that she was originally hired to fundamentally transform the broken company. but she desperately needed to experience the unfiltered reality before making sweeping decisions. She noted that she never once needed to fake an elaborate persona. Simply existing as an ordinary, unprotected woman was more than enough to expose their deeply rotten core. Several executives visibly shrank down into their expensive leather chairs, staring intently at their perfectly manicured fingernails, thoroughly ashamed of their past complicity. Thomas Riley, the chief financial officer, bravely broke the heavy silence, openly admitting that his previous concerns and urgent emails regarding sudden terminations were always aggressively ignored by Edward. Lauren Newman reclaimed the floor, formally announcing the horrifying results of the swift but incredibly thorough internal legal investigation that had occurred over the last 48 hours. She detailed the discovery of systematic gender discrimination, the deliberate destruction of severe harassment complaints, and the shocking misappropriation of corporate funds. The board had uncovered that Edward disguised nearly $1.5 million as basic operational expenses to secretly pay off numerous confidential legal settlements. Edward frantically slammed his fist on the table, desperately reminding them of how much massive financial growth he had personally brought to the Seattle headquarters over the years. Madeline stared at him with absolute, freezing zero emotion, coldly replying that while he may have grown the profits, he had simultaneously poisoned the very soul of the corporation with his unchecked arrogance. From the shadowy corner of the room, Sarah Brooks stepped forward, boldly operating the presentation clicker and holding her head incredibly high despite her racing heart. Edward recognized his former assistant immediately, his face contorting in raw, unadulterated fury as he viciously demanded to know if she was the traitor who leaked his private files. Sarah looked directly into the eyes of her former tormentor, stating proudly that she merely helped the undeniable truth finally step into the bright light. Lauren Newman wasted absolutely no time, formally declaring that the corporate board had unanimously voted to immediately suspend Edward Sterling from all professional duties, pending a massive criminal audit. Two highly trained, newly hired security professionals seamlessly stepped into the boardroom, completely replacing the corrupt guards who had previously harassed Madeline in the lobby. Edward looked at the large men in total, utter disbelief, his voice cracking as he weakly asked if they were actually going to publicly escort him out of the building like a common criminal. Madeline firmly confirmed his fears, insisting he leave through the exact same main front doors he so jealously guarded, so that every single employee could witness true justice being served. Hours later, the heavy atmosphere of the executive floor had shifted dramatically, feeling remarkably lighter as a brand-new silver nameplate was finally mounted beside the main office door. It proudly displayed Madeline's full title, marking the absolute end of the dark era and the promising beginning of a totally transparent, inclusive corporate regime. She immediately convened a massive, extraordinary session with all remaining department heads, boldly displaying the devastating investigation results for everyone to clearly see and process. Madeline did not raise her voice in anger. Instead, she spoke with profound inspiration, promising that the era of losing brilliant talent to senseless fear was officially, permanently over. Madeline swiftly outlined her immediate, non-negotiable mandates: a totally independent external audit of every single promotion over the last 5 years, and a massive, comprehensive correction of all unequal salaries. She announced the immediate creation of a fully secure, completely anonymous reporting system that would bypass middle management and go directly to the corporate board. She made it abundantly clear that she was not hunting for useless scapegoats, but rather actively seeking genuine solutions, though anyone who knowingly abused their power would definitely face severe consequences. After the meeting, Thomas Riley approached her with deep respect, admitting he had never seen such a magnificent display of controlled, productive strength in his entire corporate career. Exactly 1 year seamlessly passed since Madeline Davis officially assumed full control of Peak Innovations, and the massive Seattle headquarters was practically unrecognizable from its former toxic state. The building that was once a bleak symbol of crushing tension and severe inequality had miraculously blossomed into a brilliantly luminous, open space, filled with vibrant, genuine collaborative energy. The profound transformation was not merely reflected in the exceptionally strong financial spreadsheets, but vividly painted across the relaxed, smiling faces of the diverse people who walked the busy hallways. The previously silent, fearful corridors were now constantly buzzing with bright laughter, passionate debates, and highly productive impromptu brainstorming sessions that crossed all departmental boundaries. Madeline arrived early on a bright Tuesday morning, taking her time to walk the entire main floor, warmly greeting every single employee she passed by their correct first name. When she pushed open the heavy glass door to her office, Sarah Brooks, who had been rightfully promoted to the head of corporate personnel, was already waiting with a massive smile. Sarah proudly handed over the final quarterly report, excitedly pointing out that overall employee turnover had miraculously dropped by a staggering 40% in just 12 short months. Furthermore, anonymous internal surveys definitively proved that 92% of the entire workforce now genuinely considered the daily corporate environment to perfectly safe, incredibly positive, and deeply supportive. A soft knock interrupted their joyful review as Thomas Riley stepped into the spacious office, carrying an additional stack of highly impressive financial documents under his arm. With a highly satisfied grin, Thomas announced that the annual global results had just been officially published, revealing a massive 18% increase in total corporate revenue. The brilliant financial success served as undeniable, concrete proof that treating human beings with genuine respect and fostering an inclusive workplace was actually the ultimate, most profitable business strategy. Thomas looked at Madeline with profound admiration, openly admitting that he never ever imagined he would witness this company become a shining international beacon of modern corporate empathy. To properly celebrate the monumental anniversary, the executive team organized a massive gathering in the main auditorium for all the newly hired employees who had joined during the Cultural Revolution. The massive room was packed completely full of eager, incredibly diverse young professionals representing vastly different backgrounds, experiences, and brilliant perspectives. Madeline stepped up to the wooden podium, gently tapping the microphone, and looked out over the sea of hopeful faces with a deeply serene, loving expression. She began her speech by softly recounting her chaotic, undercover first day, reminding everyone that she initially entered the massive building not as a powerful executive, but as a totally disregarded stranger. She shared the painful lessons she learned while being completely invisible, emphasizing that true leaders absolutely never need to scream aggressively to make their important voices heard. A young, highly talented software engineer named Chloe timidly raised her hand from the second row, softly asking how they could guarantee this beautiful culture would survive long into the future. Madeline smiled warmly, promising that the only way to maintain the light was to constantly remember the dark, painful place from which they had originally started their difficult journey. She passionately urged the young professionals to fiercely protect one another, to remain incredibly human, and to never ever forget that every single quiet voice holds immense, undeniable value. The massive audience erupted into a beautifully warm, deeply emotional standing ovation that echoed loudly throughout the entire corporate tower, bringing joyful tears to Sarah's eyes. Later that evening, as the heavy Seattle rain began to fall gently against the floor-to-ceiling windows, Lauren Newman quietly joined Madeline in her dimly lit office. They shared a quiet, incredibly proud moment of reflection, looking down at the bustling city streets and acknowledging the remarkably difficult but profoundly rewarding journey they had conquered together. A few weeks later, a major international business magazine published a massive feature story detailing Madeline's revolutionary approach, inspiring countless other struggling corporations to completely dismantle their own toxic hierarchies. As Madeline stepped into the cool Seattle evening, she looked back at the glowing logo of Peak Innovations, reflecting on the profound journey of the past year. She realized a fundamental truth that applies not just to corporate boardrooms, but to the entirety of our complex human experience. True power is never about instilling fear or asserting aggressive dominance over those who stand below you. It is entirely about lifting others up, actively listening to the absolute quietest voices, and having the unwavering, tremendous courage to dismantle broken, toxic systems entirely from the inside out. Throughout our incredibly long lives, we frequently encounter harsh environments that aggressively demand we shrink our authentic, beautiful selves to perfectly fit their rigid, hopelessly outdated molds. However, the greatest and most enduring legacy we can possibly leave behind is choosing to actively reshape those difficult spaces with deep empathy and unyielding integrity. The truest, most accurate measure of a highly successful life, whether in towering office buildings or within the quiet walls of our own homes, is absolutely not found in the wealth, fancy titles, or hollow accolades we manage to accumulate. Rather, it is always found in the fundamental dignity, grace, and respect we afford to every single person who crosses our path. We must always remember that genuine kindness and formidable strength are never mutually exclusive. They are profoundly, beautifully intertwined, and together they hold the absolute power to change the world, one respectful interaction at a time.